And welcome back to another episode of Coaching with the Bible. This is episode 149, season 3, episode 40. We begin this week the fifth book of the 5 books of Moses, the book known in English as Deuteronomy, in Hebrew known as 𝘸𝘪𝘭𝘭. And our subject of the week is not an easy subject to talk about, and it's not a subject that people like to talk about, and it's something that I think that people find very uncomfortable discussing, and probably would think that as a coaching podcast or a leadership-related podcast, that this might not be a space to discuss the subject. And our subject is grief and mourning. The reason why we want to discuss these topics this week, grief and mourning, it's a gigantic topic and super important topic, and has what to do with leadership and coaching, has more to do simply with life, is because on the Jewish calendar we've entered the month of Av, and this is, for no other way to describe it, the month of national mourning. The people of Israel, the Jewish people, this is the time when the Jewish people mourn. Mourning the destruction of the temples, mourning the destruction of Jerusalem millennia ago as the eternal capital of the Jewish people. The subsequent destructions that took place and calamities and tragedies that took place over the course of time, all those coming together in this time to mourn them all, certainly including the most recent in the Holocaust. And so it's a time of grief and a time of mourning. As the fast day approaches this coming Thursday, if you are around the community of people who commemorate that day, mourn on that day, fast on that day, lament on that day, in many ways you would sense or feel as if it happened today. Now, I don't know that we can all grab completely and fully what it must have been like to be there at the time that the temple, the first one and the second one, were destroyed, and the trauma that came with that and the destruction that was with that. We get a sense of that in the Bible from Jeremiah, from the other prophets, from the narratives around the destruction of the temple. But unless you're living it, it is hard to sort of go back there all the way. And for some people, it is very difficult to mourn on this day and to shed tears and to really sense that grief. For those of us who have the great blessing of living in the land of Israel today, it's easier and harder at the same time. It's easier because you can go to the old city of Jerusalem, you can stand by the Western Wall, you can, in some cases, go up onto the Temple Mount and be in the space where that took place. You can go to other places in Israel where the Jews were expelled, sent into exile from at the time, and experience it at some level firsthand in that way. On the flip side of that, it's hard here because it's an explosively growing country in so many ways over the last 75 years. So much building is going on, so much construction, so much growth in so many ways, leaving out the current political climate, that on some level it's hard to sort of sit and wallow in the trauma of the destruction of what took place then. All that can all be true at the same time. And then if you're outside of the land of Israel, so it's easier and difficult in other ways as well. And so I wanted to dive a little bit into the sense of idea about grief and mourning from the standpoint of perhaps maybe two parts of this. Sort of a leader, when a leader mourns, or the ability of a leader to mourn, And then when someone on your team is mourning, is in grief. And appreciate that basically we all grieve differently. We all mourn differently. There's a great quote, which I think really gets to that, from someone by the name of 𝘨𝑗𝘬𝘢. Grief can't be shared. Everyone carries it alone, his own burden in his own way. We all go through it. We all go through it differently. And the experience, or where a person is at the moment when grief or mourning overtakes them, can be different at different points in a person's life. If they're younger and they're now suddenly thrown into the space of tragedy and trauma and mourning, it might mean one thing, it might be experienced one way. If a person is older and experiences it differently, at a different stage in life, it can be experienced differently. If the relationship with the person who is no longer with us is strained, so then it's one experience of mourning and tragedy and emotion. And if it's a deeply close personal relationship, it's a different thing. When you're the leader, you face different other pieces, which is how much can you mourn in public? You're maybe struggling with how much you're willing to share, how vulnerable you'll be willing to be around your constituents, around voters, around employees in those spaces, and how much you want to share versus how much you want to hide. I remember vividly after 9/11, it was just President Bush at the time in different interviews talked about how much emotion he was okay with showing in public and how much he held back and saved for private moments. How much he shared with the public in speeches and in visits, and how much he shared for when he was back in the White House. President Obama subsequently also spoke about the one experience that he remembered where a Secret Service member was brought to tears was when they went to visit and spend the day with the families in Sandy Hook. Generally speaking, people in those spaces have to be a certain way. They have to be hard, they have to be cold, they have to be focused, and they can't let their emotions or their sense of grief or the sense of mourning or the trauma and the tragedy of it get in their way, because they have to perform a certain role. And sometimes you can't, and sometimes you won't, and sometimes you need to sort of let that out. And so it's an important thing to appreciate that this is a factor in everyone's life, and that no one is exempt from it, and no one can avoid it, really. We just simply experience it differently. We experience it at different times. I remember distinctly in my own life, early on in my rabbinate, the very short period of time, I told you guys a lot about the rabbinate period. When I was a rabbi in a small synagogue, so a friend of mine passed away rather quickly and rather suddenly after a very short illness. There was no way to grieve for that publicly, and so I, kept it private. It was something that I was going through that no one even knew about in the community. My family knew about it, but no one else knew about it. And so it was something that I was trying to grapple with, deal with, get through at the same time to stay in the role and still do my job and still be there for other people. I remember also similarly the first time, not just doing a funeral, but the first time that I had been present when a congregant passed on, and how admittedly traumatic that was for me to experience, and then to sort of go on with life, regular after that. Those are really hard things to sort of go through. And so how do you do that when you're the leader in that regard? And then how do you do that for somebody on your team who is suffering, who's going through it? And so in an article in the Harvard Business Review, they talk about the fact that at work, or in a lot of situations, but really at work, that managers and leadership are there to celebrate. They're ready and prepared to celebrate births and birthdays and anniversaries, victories, wins, all that other stuff. And maybe a little bit of somebody being ill and out for a short period of time, but death, the trauma and the tragedy of death not so much. People avert their gaze, the term is that in the article, they shy away from it, they fall silent. They want to try to avoid putting their team through grief. They want to spare the team the grief. And so what ends up happening is they leave the person who is in that bereaved state, who is in that mourning state, very much alone in the world. So that person is, quote unquote, only mourning and only in grief with their relatives and loved ones, but their team is, away, separate, distinct, unconnected, disconnected from that pain, from that grief. And so in the article there, they talk about something called the conspiracy of silence. It says, was coined by someone by the name of Julia Samuel, who also wrote a book called Grief Works. It's a conspiracy of silence that creates more harm than it actually does good for anybody. The person doesn't sense or feel the support from their team in those spaces, that sense then that the relationship with those people is eroding because they don't have that connection in that real time of need from the people that they work with. And we might think, as being those people, if we're on the team of people who are surrounding someone who is suffering a loss, that they just need their space. So that distance and that silence is exactly what they don't need. And what it creates, she writes, is something called disenfranchised grief. It's a loss that describes a loss that is not or cannot be openly acknowledged, publicly mourned, or socially supported. Just sort of think about how that operates. Person is mourning, a person's in grief for whatever it is. For whatever it is, it's a loss of a person. It could be, take it up or down the notch, however you want to do that. It could be spiritual loss in the sense that, like the case of a synagogue or a church or a mosque or a temple, whatever, the ancient temple being burnt down or destroyed, right? Some symbol of their faith that is destroyed. It could be that they lost a person. It could be even that they lost a pet. As not a pet owner, it's not something that I'm naturally attuned to. But you read enough literature on discussions of empathy and compassion and tragedy and loss and what people feel and how they feel when it is that the dog that they had for 12 years passes away, that's a meaningful relationship for them in their life. It's someone important, something important in their life. And so we have to appreciate that we all handle these things differently, and we have to really do our best to handle them perhaps better than we're doing right now. And so what we have to appreciate is also this. It doesn't appear that grief is something that we can work on. The article talks about the idea that grief works on us. So we can't work on grief. We can work through grief. So we can't work on it, but we can work through it. And at best, we work through it, and we work through it best with support. And so how do we do that as leaders? How do we do that in those spaces, wherever the case may be? It could be, again, something as big as the loss of a family member, a spouse, a parent, a sibling, a child. It could be something smaller, the end of a relationship. It could be, again, some sort of a destruction. I remember years ago also when I was in the rabbinate, the home of a member family burnt to the ground. And so their immediate reaction and the trauma that they went through was drastic and dramatic. It almost felt like over the top crazy how dramatic it got. But I mean, again, one never knows how far that trauma goes for every individual. Everyone handles it differently. And so we have to sort of think about how we want to do this, how we want to think about it, what our role is in this situation. So I saw really great, and we don't have to go here into the conversation around the 5 languages of grief, because I think that is more obvious to anybody, but I'll mention them just briefly, right? So the five levels of grief and how we sort of go through those things and sort of appreciate what those things are, right? So number 1, in terms of grief, is denial, the 5 stages of grief. So the first one is denial. This comes from Elisabeth Kubler-Ross. She was building on earlier research and literature on the same subject by someone by the name of Professor, I think it's Bowlby. But the 5 stages of grief. First is denial, right? Denial. Then we have anger. We have bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. And then sort of the idea, according to Kubler-Ross, is that you sort of progress from one to the next. The earlier research and more subsequent research is that a person goes through this trauma, goes through this mourning, goes through this grief in an ebb and a flow. And so you move into certain stages. So you'll be in denial first, and then maybe you'll have some period of time of acceptance, and then you'll come back to some sense of depression later on. All those things are true at the same time. Again, because everybody handles it and everybody deals with it differently. But it's important, again, to appreciate that, how that is and how that works. So what's sort of a quote-unquote, a simple way to manifest this as a leader and a better leader in this space? Obviously you want to work on your empathy and things like that. You can appreciate the following very basic structure that I saw in a different article, which was this: be present, be patient, be open. Be present, be patient, be open. Be present in the moments of loss, be patient with the inconsistency that it generates, and be open to its growth potential. Appreciate the fact that as simple as a structure and a strategy that is, obviously it's not simple to necessarily implement. It's really not easy to implement per se. But also appreciate that the opportunity, and I hate to say that there's opportunity from grief, but there is opportunity that comes from grief, is also there. That this is actually, again, we don't want anyone, we don't wish upon anyone tragedy or trauma, mourning or grief, and appreciate that what comes out of that can be obviously very different, but also very powerful, and perhaps on some level, as a group, as a team, as a leader, even better. So when you're the leader, you want to operate in those 3 spaces, and those 3 ways: be present, be patient, be open, to be the best you can possibly be in those things. Now, what does that mean? To be present is in the first thing, like I mentioned before, that sort of disenfranchised sense of silence that happens when the leader doesn't acknowledge the loss that someone on their team is going through. That's part of that. So to be present is simply making that very uncomfortable phone call. Not trying to fix it. I know we try to fix things. There's no fixing that. But just being present and available to the person who's going through it. Michael Lewis, the author Michael Lewis, from Moneyball and all kinds of other great works, in a podcast discussing grief after the death of his daughter in a car accident, really discuss this notion of being present. We talked about a neighbor friend of his who simply just sat on the front porch of his home while the Lewis family was going through this tragedy. Just said, I'm going to be there. Didn't do anything. He didn't intrude. He wasn't in the way. He was just present. And Michael Lewis describes how powerful and how meaningful that was to know that that person was there and that person was with him during this time of grief. Not trying to fix anything, not trying to make anything better, just present. And how meaningful, how powerful that is, what a relationship that kind of be. So that's the first thing, is really there. The second thing related to sort of being present is simply being, in a space where you're available to provide for the person in their space, in their time of need, without judgment, without any sense of quid pro quo, just being present. That's first. Being patient is appreciating that with respect to this individual and where they are now, there's no clear sense of how that person's going to come out of that on the other side, or how long it's going to take, quote unquote, for that person to come through their grief. There's a lot of literature on the subject of companies and businesses and the amount of grief time, for lack of a better term, that they give to employees when they're going through this, and how they structure policies and protocols for the spouses of deceased employees and things like that, how much time they give off, how they go about it, how they express it, how they talk about it. That's very important. But also appreciate that if a person's performance is off, subsequent to that, that is normal for a person who's going through that kind of trauma and that kind of grief in that kind of situation. And not expect necessarily that it's going to come back right away. The best thing there is to be communicative and to discuss at the same time that you're providing the time and the space for the person, but to talk it through. The other thing that can be done there as well is that it can actually be an opportunity, again, or a moment to lift off some of the burden and responsibility that that person has, and to provide by delegation to other people on the team to step up and step forward in those moments. And the last, to be open, is just to be there and to be, open to the possibility that with respect to a person who's going through this, that this could actually change them. This could actually drive them in a different way. This could actually make them decide to make larger, bigger life decisions, and that's totally okay. And so that you can be open to the possibilities of what it means for that person. So to be present, to be patient, and to be open, and to appreciate that all those things are valuable and meaningful and important for the person who's going through loss. On the flip side of that, to just take one extra minute on this subject here, is if you're the leader going through this, two things. One, as the person whose leader is going through this, do not avoid that person who's going through this just because they're the leader of your team, the leader of your company, the leader of your community. They need it too. They need the shoulders. They need the support. They need those things as well. It's really valuable to be that person who steps into the space of grief where the leader is grieving and provide them with the sense of empathy and compassion that they need in those spaces and not let them have to go through that alone. And relatedly, as the leader who's going through it, the monumental impact that it has when you allow the people around you to care for you and to provide for you in your moments of loss and grief and trauma and mourning is perhaps indescribable. I remember many years ago, a mentor rabbi of mine lost, I believe it was his mother at the time. And he was, as we do in the Jewish community, he was sitting Shiva. He was going through that 7-day mourning period. And he was a rabbi of a very large community. And he didn't appreciate how meaningful it was for the members of his community when they were able to come and comfort him and tell stories or not tell stories, listen and just be present in his life in that moment, how meaningful it was for them. The opportunity for them to sort of give back to him in the moment where he had done it for them so many times, where he needed it for himself. And so we started covering sort of three areas. So the leader in the company with respect to handling and dealing with and managing someone on the team that's going through grief and mourning, being the leader who is going through that space and being from the standpoint of allowing people to be of help to you and being the person who can help a leader in that space. And to appreciate that all these things are true at exactly the same moments. And appreciate maybe the last part of this. As we go through this here, as we're about to commemorate and go through again the trauma and the grief and the mourning of the date of the destruction of the temple, appreciate that grief and tragedy and mourning, not necessarily tragedy, but grief and mourning are part of life. The Bible talks about it extensively, using the terms of discussions of grief and weeping and tearing and rending clothing in a bunch of places. Death is part of life. Grief and mourning are part of life. And appreciate the following. Grief never ends. This is a quote from an unknown source. Grief never ends, but it changes. It's a passage, not a place to stay. Grief is not a sign of weakness nor a lack of faith. It is the price of love. That is coaching coaching with the Bible for this week. Look forward to seeing you next week. Next week when we hit, I believe, episode 100. and 50.